Hello and welcome to this discussion where I'll be talking about Persephone, Hecate, and Demeter. Now, it's very important how I structured the order of their names. In the story of Persephone that most of us are familiar with, that is based on the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Hecate is the divine mediator. She's the go-between, the negotiator, the guide, and so on. She has an important place between Persephone and Demeter, and she is important in the stories that are told about them, in that she is in this place of mediator in a modern term. During the season of release, we are focusing on the three of them regarding three specific aspects of them. Chthoniah is their underworld aspects. Lampadios is them as the torchbearers, the illuminators. And Forba explores how they are connected to catharsis and releasing miasma is what they called it in the ancient world, but releasing toxins is what we would call it today. Today, what I'm talking about is their chthonic aspects and giving a little bit of an orientation to how we're going to be journeying with them throughout the season of release. So let's light our candle. And if you don't have one, just connect with the energy that I freely offer. This trio of goddesses has remained part of our consciousness for at least 3,000 years. If we look at the earlier versions of the story that scholars believe influenced the Homeric hymn to Demeter, which itself was written about 2,500 years ago, but that's when it was written down. It is believed, and I fully concur, that this story is much, much, much older. So let's start to connect to these goddesses who have found their way throughout the Christian era, who have resurfaced, especially since the Romantic era, so about 150 years ago or so, found their way in art, in statuary, in stories, starting with Carl Jung, found their way into psychology. They abide, and they abide with us. We are them, and they are our guides, guardians, and gatekeepers. And they certainly hold the keys to the mysteries within and the greater mysteries of the meaning of life, the nature of the cosmos, and what is the soul. There's so much to them. So let's begin with our simple ritual of cleansing the space. And then let's bring our energy together and connecting with the three of them, the goddesses of the cave. And let's begin to explore them. To understand Demeter, Hecate, and Persephone, or Persephone, Hecate, and Demeter, again, pay attention to the order I put the three of them in because it's going to give you a reference point for how I'm discussing them. To understand them personally, and then to connect to their history, is one of the most healing endeavors or journeys, if you like, that we can embark upon. To see ourselves reflected in each of them, in their similarities and their differences. The two major sources of historical knowledge about them, I've already referred to one, which is the Homeric hymn to Demeter. The other major source of knowledge comes from the rituals at a place called Eleusis in modern-day Greece. And the featured background to help us connect to their energy is the entrance to the cave at Eleusis. And our invocation today really is the entire Homeric hymn to Demeter. If you haven't read it, there are many different translations out there. I'm going to be referencing a couple of them. I really recommend, if you have the capacity, to read the different translations and find the richness in each one. It's just such a beautiful story. But no one, either of the deathless gods or of the mortal men, heard her voice, nor yet the olive trees bearing rich fruit. Only tender-hearted Hekate, bright-coiffed, the daughter of Perses, heard the girl from her cave. And this is from what is probably the most commonly known translation of the Homeric hymn, and was done by a scholar, a male scholar, during the late Victorian period in England. And when we are becoming scholars ourselves of this story, looking at the dates of the translations is very important, because the cultural zeitgeist, the cultural values and mores of the time influence the language chosen when the translator takes the ancient Greek text, or Latin sometimes, and puts it into English. So during the Victorian time, of course, the emphasis, the values were on, it was a very chaste period. Sexuality was very repressed. There was an emphasis on marriage, home, traditional roles, and so on. So we're going to see that seeping into the translation. But it is a beautiful translation. The language is gorgeous and lush. So that is that translation that, like I said, is probably the most common one. And even today, over 100 years later, is the one that is still most widely referenced in terms of what I've encountered in doing my studies. My entire book, Entering Hecate's Cave, is devoted to Hekate, Persephone, and Demeter. And indeed, I start the book with the quote that I just read as invocation, but I do it from a modern translation that I really, really highly recommend. So open up your copy, go right to that first page, and you'll see that, and then you'll see that modern translation. And that'll give you another source for connecting to this story. This is a little verse from the Triformis chapter. They certainly are goddesses of transformation, both in the stories and, of course, in the rituals at Eleusis, and how they come to us. Hekate, guide and protector, wise woman speaking truth to power, protecting the vulnerable. Persephone began as the nameless girl, became benevolent queen who turned the seasons and guide of souls. Demeter knew the pain, tried to protect daughter, raged until balance was restored. Together, the whole trinity, the above, the below, and the in-between. So in that same chapter, there is a lengthy section describing the story of Persephone Demeter and Hekate, and both in the Homeric hymn and at Eleusis. So let's just glimpse at what I had to say. The goddesses Hekate, Persephone, and Demeter were entwined throughout myths and practices in the ancient world in a glorious web of mystery. Hekate emerges from her cave to console the maiden Persephone, thereby demonstrating the healing powers of the darkness. All three goddesses are certainly at work within us and through us. We can be Persephone, thrust into misery. We can be Demeter, raging against unfairness, or we can be Hekate, acting as mediator for others in distress, and also ourselves. In Persephone's mythology, Hekate comes to her when no one else will, and she also gives advice to Demeter in her sadness. There is some evidence that all three were venerated in the same temples, and some scholars believe that Hekate played a central role in the mystery cult at Eleusis. Most important, all three offer healing for the soul. They come to show us how to persevere and go deeper into healing. They teach us that wholeness is found in their mysteries. In fact, we can integrate the lessons of their myths into our own healing journey. As mediator, Hekate helps to negotiate the terms of Persephone's time in the underworld and takes on the responsibility for being her guardian. She continues this role as Persephone's guide back and forth from her subterranean life to the solar world, thus turning the seasons. This journey to and from the underworld represents our own journey into Hecate's cave, for Persephone found her wholeness only through facing her own fears, accepting her circumstances, and eventually becoming the benevolent queen of the depths. In fact, our journey is that of Persephone. We set out as the bone-weary traveler who has suffered greatly, seeking the respite of the cave, all the while knowing that the path forward will be rocky at times. Our Demeter, focused solely on the outer world, rests while we explore our interior landscape, to be reunited when we emerge from the cave born anew. Their soul healing is embodied in this reunion into wholeness. A psychological analysis of the Hekate Persephone Demeter triad reveals that each is contained within us as different aspects of the sacred feminine. Hekate is the soul, the mediator between the psyche, or the more surface mind, Persephone, and the persona, what we show to the world, is Demeter. Demeter had an interior life, and Persephone certainly had an external one. So there's that balance. Hekate walks between the worlds, as does our own soul, guiding us along the way. Moreover, in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, Persephone is depicted as Kore, the maiden, while Demeter is described as Mater, the mother. Hekate, as the embodiment of wisdom, can be seen as the crone. As symbols, it's important to note, though, that at the time when this story would have been told, way back when, that Hekate would not have been seen as an old woman by them then, because to them, the gods were relatively ageless. They kind of went from being children to being adults, but they never really grew old like humans do. As symbols of the natural cycle of the world, Kore, young Persephone, is potential. Demeter is the vibrancy of the green world, and the mature Persephone, which means destruction, which we'll be discussing more during Babur Forba, is death. Hekate is the force that binds them. When we look more closely at these three goddesses, we discover that they all achieved radical self-acceptance. Demeter relinquished being a mother. Persephone let go of her innocence. Hekate stepped away when her role as mediator had ended. Thus, the journey of the cave is one of self-acceptance, radical self-acceptance. For as long as we reject what we know to be true in the center of our being, there is no wholeness. Now, I'm focusing on Chthoniah this month, since that's the month that we're diving into. So Chthoniah, usually pronounced Chthoniah, but also Chthonia, is one of Hecate's most ancient titles. Now, I have a lot of thoughts about what I wrote in the book on this section. So, excuse me, we're going to dive in deep. So you may want to grab your pen to make some notes or however you record thoughts. Deities are considered chthonic if they abide in the underworld, as opposed to ouranic deities who reside on high. To the ancients, that would have been Olympus. Hekate and Persephone are chthonic queens, while Demeter is an ouranic goddess. So here's what I want to really focus on. I made a couple of points in that little paragraph that I want us to circle around for a bit. It's complicated considering Hekate, a chthonic goddess, even from the ancients. She had chthonic aspects. In the myths, she lives in the cave. She's involved in Eleusis. Those are rituals of the cave. However, we also know from other sources, such as Hesiod's Theogony, that the ancients believed that Hekate had dominion over all three worlds, land, sea, and sky. So she wasn't chiefly chthonic, although in this story and in the rituals at Eleusis, she is chthonic. I hope you're staying with me, so that it's complicated just to say that she was purely a dark goddess or an underworld goddess when we look at how the ancients would have understood her. And then it gets even more complicated because by certain groups, she was considered very ouranic or celestial in being the world soul. And there is, I have a pod episode out, and also in Hecate's Crossroads, there's an episode I did on Proclus that talks more about her as ouranic. Persephone was certainly both, even though she was queen of the underworld. That was only for part of the year, and the rest of the time she would have been an Olympian or dwelling on high. So it's very complicated. Within Chthonia, we are focusing on the descent, right, of going into the earth and how they guide us like into that earthiness. I don't confuse chthonic deities with the modern definition of earth goddesses. They're very two different images, right? So earth goddesses today, the way we might say that would be like, don't fool with Mother Nature. So that's the goddess kind of what they, in the ancient world, in the Greek, for the Greeks, they would have sometimes called Gaia. That's very different. All three can be considered those type of goddesses, connected to fertility, fecundity, and so on. But they weren't just that. So it's an important distinction. Chthonic means of the earth. It doesn't mean of the surface. It doesn't refer to, the natural world that we can see. It is the down below. It is, as we go into the season of the cave, the season of release and autumn, it is that descent energy where we, after summer, we have been in the surface world, even within our lives. Now we are choosing to go down their steps into their realness. Like, what is the earth? It's where roots are. It's where animals go in the winter. It's where caves are. It's the depths of the ocean. That is chthonic. And to the ancients, that was also the underworld. And another idea to consider is that for the ancients, humans always returned to the underworld. And that was the soul's home base. That's where we went when we died. That's where we emerged from to be reborn. That only ouranic or celestial deities like the Olympians, like Zeus and Hera, and that aspect of Demeter, and even Persephone had that aspect, and Hecate could also go there, would be, the celestial Mount Olympus, if you've seen, those images. So, but humans belong to the underworld. We spent our time on the surface, and then down below we went. So when we are saying a goddess or a god is chthonic, we are saying that they are very much involved in humanity, in our mortal lives and existence. So it's a really important point about the chthonic. Demeter's chthonic aspects are really fascinating to me, and why caves were so important. So if we consider that it is believed that the Homeric hymn to Demeter is actually a much, much older story than even that, the first recording of it in that hymn, then agriculture at that time was very, very different than what it was to become in the following centuries. And specifically, harvest grain used to be stored in caves and underground. That the coolness, the dark, and so on was like ancient refrigeration, basically. And I grew up with a grandmother who had a root cellar. Even now, I have this fondness for cheese that is aged in caves. So it still lingers, this idea of the benefits of food being stored in caves and underground, and that it's a very safe place. And so to them, this was where the richness was. This is like Hades. Hades' richness is that all bounty is stored in Hades, the underworld king, Hades' realm, and that Demeter, Persephone, and Hekate are associated with all of this richness that is only found by descending. And that is such a powerful metaphor for how we can turn inward to that richness within us. If we're only just looking at what's on the surface of our lives, it can seem like we don't have much. But when we start to connect to what is deeper within us, and that descent into our own strength, our own imagination, our own creativity, our own resourcefulness, that's where the healing is, right? That's where the good stuff is. And it's interesting to track how this changed in agriculture. So agriculture went from being something that was deeply connected to the chthonic. I should also mention here, this idea that when this story was told around those ancient fires, that they had a strong appreciation of roots and seeds, and how the earth underneath of it was what made them all grow. There were no crops without the rich soil. And if you've ever seen modern agriculture where crops are failing and they're doing all of these things to kind of make the crops return, it's because in some instances the soil, because of our how we live our lives, and we're so harmful to this planet in general, that the soil has been depleted of its natural resources. And I'm going to save a deep dive on this for Babor Forba, but here's where compost becomes so important. And again, kind of time traveling back to them, they didn't go to the superstore to pick up their vegetables, or even a farmer's market. They had markets, but their connection to the importance of Chthonia, of the soil, of the caves, of what is underground, it was part of their everyday lives. It was life and death. If the soil wasn't fertile, if the things weren't stored properly in the cave during the fallow season, they could die. And that's something that in the modern world, we just can't connect to it, because we live in a world of convenience. We live in a world where agriculture is far removed from most of us. And just thinking about the difference between like Hecate's garden and the natural world and that, and then going into Chthonia and saying, okay, so this is the descent. This is where I honor the soil, that I honor the roots, I honor the seeds, I honor, and again, I'm going to say this for Rayor, but I honor that the natural waste of life is necessary for regeneration. Like, this is it. And where is that in our own lives as we descend into this richness that is, sometimes very dark and not, it's not like a pristine marble temple somewhere, right? This is about getting messy. And again, that's more for Rayor, but Chthonia starts us, we get our feet dirty, right? We get our feet dirty. And if you've ever done like mud bathing or kind of dug a hole and then stood in the hole, even like, when you're a kid and you you dig a hole at the beach and you get covered in sand, and that's like that's the energy of Chthonia, right? That's the very tip of it. But it's like that idea. Certainly burying our dead is interesting because even though largely in Western culture, the idea of heaven is very much like we become gods, right? Like we go up to Olympus, we call it heaven today. We go up. We don't descend into the underworld. However, we bury our dead in the ground. So there's that, I would say it's a disconnect, right? But there's still that element of, even though we may see that, oh, we're going to go up to heaven, there is still that acknowledgement that we have to be returned to Chthonia by burial. There's many different ways we could dispose of the dead, but we put them in the ground. So Chthonia is still with us in her ways. Margie has reimagined the beautiful triple goddess she did for the summer with Circe and Medea to now transforming them into Demeter and Persephone. So this is a way you can connect with them and see how Hekate abides and her companions change. It's interesting, right? And there is our spirit card for the goddesses of the cave. What I'm going to do with the Book of Shadows for the 3 months of release is put up some prompts with 3 blanks and then the designed spirit card, and give you some key questions just to kind of frame your explorations. So great goddesses of relief, what messages, we're focusing on boundaries as we go into Chthonia. So what messages are they giving you about boundaries? And this is where I highly recommend working with that great goddesses oracle reading and emphasizing this trinity within the reading. So the reading contains 3 trinities. It's the Hekate, Medea, Hekate, Medea, Circe, Hekate, Demeter, Persephone, and then Hekate, Selene, Artemis. We're going to do Hekate, Selene, Artemis during retrieval season, winter, and then we'll return to these 3 during rebirth season or spring, and look at their kind of above ground, how they emerge from the cave aspects through rebirth and so on. And then when we come back to renewal garden season, summer, we'll return to Circe, Medea, and Hekate. So I'm really excited about this new approach and just have fun experiencing how they connect and working with these blanks. If you haven't yet watched Hecate's History, the 2-parter, definitely watch that. I talk a lot more about Demeter, Persephone, and Hekate there. And then we have the whole section. So this is in Hecate's Crossroads. Then we have the whole section on Hecate's companions in Hecate's Crossroads too. This is a recorded class. And then there are some written lessons that will help you connect to all of them. And next month, I will do another recorded class where we look at the three of them and their torches as we explore the meaning of Lampadios. So I hope you've enjoyed considering the chthonic aspects of Hekate, Demeter, and Persephone, and how you are getting rooted in them and getting rooted in your own descent into your own realness, your own depths, your own what cannot be seen, you know, that psyche, what's inside of you. And of course, this is very lunar. The cave was associated with the lunar. And also, you know, the Great Mother. So all three can be seen as the Great Mother and were in different regions of the ancient Mediterranean. So we see that this Great Mother, and in this story, she's kind of divided into this triplicity, right? She's the wise one, she's the mother, she's the maiden. And beyond this kind of gender role parameter, we can see that this functions within ourselves as we go on this journey of healing, as we mature. I want to just briefly talk about the first part of the ritual of Eleusis, which is the ritual that we do at the end of release season. We call it the animarum catharsis. I've called it in different places the death walking ritual of release. This is inspired by the first ritual at Eleusis, where there was cleansing that was done, where sacrifices, might have killed a pig and so on to transfer the miasma from them. So our whole rituals of the cave cycle is inspired by the rituals at Eleusis. Now, they did this in a relatively short period of time. We stretch it out over several months so we can go into that deep psychospiritual inquiry into ourselves. And we augment this through natural magic, right? Through our witchcrafting that we do throughout the time. Chthonia is the very beginning of this journey. Don't rush. Don't fuss over doing absolutely every little thing. Just connect to the spirit of Chthonia, the descent, the earthiness, the cave. And like I said, I highly recommend hanging that Great Goddesses oracle reading with special attention to the trio that we're focusing on now, really making that the center point of your practice, and even perhaps taking those three cards. And I would do it once for the season. I wouldn't do it a bunch of times. You could, I mean, if you were really skilled at reading, it could even be your quotidian. You could do it for each day with the three of them. But a kind of more realistic approach might be to do it once per season and then deep dive with them. It really, in terms of readings, it depends on your skill set. And I'll talk more about this. I think we are having a quotidia class coming up, and I'll talk more about working with the Great Goddess Oracle in conjunction with release. So I hope you are connecting to this energy of Chthonia, and hail Persephone, hail Hekate, and hail Demeter, and hail the spirit of Chthonia.